Welcome to the United States of America podcast. I am your host, Niti, and we are broadcasting live from the Food Church here on North Carolina. If you missed past episodes, please be sure to take the time to watch the first episode and watch the rest like a documentary. We are people at peace, and we have declared peace to all nations around the world. This is not a marketing or promotional channel, and we are shining a light on knowledge that is being hidden from you. We are sharing the truth about your birthright and your inheritance. We have moderators who are assisting in the comment section. Be kind and self-govern. If you have questions, please put them in all caps and only enter them once per show. I am joined on air with Greg Clarkson, regenerative farmer and an ASN on Kansas. Now I am proud to introduce you to Justice Anna Maria, who is joining us live from Alaska today. Welcome, Anna.
Hello, Niti. You are right in the middle of my office, which has been deconstructed, torn apart, and is in the process of reconstruction, just like our government.
Hey, this is what we do, right? All of us American ladies, we're just rolling up our, well, all Americans, Greg, all Americans, we roll our sleeves up, we get it going, and we get her done.
Hey, those guys come in handy when it's time to move the furniture.
Absolutely. How's it going, Greg?
Very good. Very good. Beautiful weather out here in Kansas. So yeah, it's going great.
Cool. Early harvest time?
Yeah, it's getting there. It's getting there. Yeah, it's about to get crazy in 1 week, and then it'll get crazy.
What's the order of your harvest there in Kansas? What comes first?
You know, if people are growing winter cereals, you'll harvest barley, then triticale, then wheat, somewhere in there oats, and then after that it's usually corn, and then your soybeans and your warm season legumes are usually last. And we also grow millet or a milo, as it's called around here. There's a lot of milo, and it'll be late this year. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's about the order. And about the time you're finishing up the corn and the warm season legumes, the winter cereals start for planting. So it's a 12-month cycle, never a break.
Yeah, well, Kansas is kind of different than the farm land that I grew up in, for sure. Certainly it's a cereal based economy there, and lots of grain production, and so it's a little bit foreign to me, but I know that it's really important to keep building up your soil, because some crops give back to the soil and some take away tremendously from the soil. So balancing out that rotation and making sure you've got good ongoing soil preservation practices and everything is so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's where the livestock come in, and we have to run the livestock over the land.
Yep. So we have chickens, we have cattle, and we have crop ground. I'm trying to do things quite differently. I'm trying to break from the system, or have broken from the system for that matter. So we do all regenerative, running the livestock onto the ground as well. But all of the crops that we grow are what you'd say non-conventional or non-commodity crops. And what that means is, and this is why it's really important with what we're talking about, but what that means is, to the average farmer, the bank wouldn't give them a loan to plant the crops that I grow. The crop insurance programs that are out there won't insure these crops because they don't conform to the standards. So I'm trying to prove that you can make this by being out of the system. Or I am proving, I shouldn't say trying. I am proving that you can make this by being out of the system. It's all about money. It's all about finance, though, to be able to break away, buy your inputs. Because if you think about a farmer will start spending money in the fall. They'll spend money in the spring, all the way along, and then they finally get a payback late summer on that money they started spending in the fall. But through that whole time, they're carrying that cost all the way through that. And so it's really a cash flow, difficult financial thing for farmers to do without relying on a bank.
Right.
Well, and also it's always, farming's always kind of a crapshoot. You never know what kind of weather you're going to get.
Exactly.
So, you can have an entire crop destroyed by an insect infestation, a drought, flood, cold spring. I mean, there are so many things that a farmer is up against just in terms of the realities of the weather and climate and everything else that goes on.
So
So,
what we've tried
Well,
to
we're
do,
mitigating that. Oh, sorry.
yeah, no, that's exactly what I was going to say, Niti, is
Uh-huh.
we're trying to mitigate the weather impacts. So by restoring your soil, by getting the plant rotations, and we do a lot of cover crop where we purposely do not harvest it. We just put all that back into the soil, getting the livestock. What you do is you grow the soil microbiome and the soil microbiology. And then another really important thing that happens is you get soil that acts as a sponge. So we can measure our soil by taking a coffee can, so big, and you dump water into that and you see how much water is soaked up by the soil. And if you take a standard conventional farm, they would be lucky to take in a half an inch an hour rate. And some of my ground is taking in 3 to 4 inches an hour. So when it rains, we want to keep that water. We don't want it running off to the road ditch. And that helps us be resilient to those either too much water, or that years you barely get any water, because we see all of them.
And
yeah,
that's been reversing all of the damage that the Department of Ag has done, for example. So everything that we're doing, Anna, with the regenerative ag is completely opposite of that, and proving that when you are dancing with nature, then it serves you. And
Yeah.
it's not hard. And you don't have to have all those obstacles with the weather, because you also are improving microclimates by running the livestock. So when you're rotating livestock over the pastures, rotating the plants, and and having sacrificial
Mhm.
growth in between. And it's not really a sacrifice, is it, Greg? Because you're feeding the
No.
livestock. So you end up making it a hoop where we're getting back to the migratory action of the livestock that was actually blamed for the soil erosion. And then, Alan Savory actually has helped us show that it is not what was browning the earth, that man's interference was browning the earth, that the livestock actually was keeping it green. And they, when those herds would come through that were miles long and miles wide, then they would restore the land. It looked like they were destroying it, but they weren't. That pressure, that impact, that natural pressure was basically better than tilling the soil. It was kind of taking it down. They were fertilizing it. And as a side effect of that, you had a more, uh, prolifer. Prol- prolifer-
Proliferation.
Can't even
Uh-oh.
talk this morning.
like a buffalo tractor as opposed to a chicken tractor, something like that.
Yes, because you know what it is, Anna? It's magnetism. So the energy of the livestock actually works as a magnetic force to pull the life-giving force out of the soil. And it's all about magnets. And it's funny because Yeshua spoke of magnets. And as soon as men finally comprehend the power of magnets, that we would be able to heal all. And that's what magnets do. So that's just a beginning of that. But can we also take this back? I would like this first half hour, if we can, Anna. I want to take you back to something that I just learned. And I'm like, why did we not know this before? I'll tell you why we didn't know it from you before, is because you've come so far. You have come such a long way that obviously it's not natural for you to regress to this step one to explain, step one stories. But your information isn't everywhere, and a lot of it in terms of the way that the articles were written, for example, I think that was kind of a different situation. You're giving us a lot of like instruction, and there's so many things in the articles that are so important to us. But this story is like, how how and why are the Pope, why is the Pope working with the Brits in the first place? Like, how does this even work? That 60-40 split. Where is this coming from? And I just learned from you about John, King John, and the Commonwealth and the whole Williams, like what happened going back to William the Conqueror, how he bequeathed his inheritance to his 8 barons and he sacrificed his son. And did he just have one son or what was the story? But like
Oh,
when you explained that John was working with the Pope with the Commonwealth land of England, I was like, oh my goodness, this is what happened. Can you please tell this story for us this morning? Like, if you can, a little short version of it.
sure. Okay. Let's go back to the Dark Ages. And let's go back to a character that we know as Lancelot, whose name was his actual name was Guillaume, which means William, which means resolute protector. Okay. Anyway, this young prince was the son of King Lot and Lady Elaine of the Lake. And so he's known in English and in some French narratives as Lancelot de Lac. But actually, this character was a real person. He wasn't just this sort of nom de guerre that we've given him. His actual name was Guillaume de Belcher. And he had an ancestral home that was known as Joyeux Garde, or Joyous Garde, as in a guard castle. But that disappeared from the face of history when he renamed it. And he renamed it Bellegarde, which means beautiful guard or guardian castle, because he said it was still beautiful but would never be joyous again after all that he experienced in England. So after the big blow up that everybody knows about in song and dance, he returned to France. And France is where that entire family came from. They were all Norman French. Guinevere is a French name. Lancelot means little plot of land. Elaine, his mother, was the Lady of the Lake because she owned a property on a lake where in the Auvergne region of France. She came from the Auvergne. So anyway, when you're talking about the Arthurian legends, you're really talking about French people. You're talking about Norman French people who were in England, who had gone to England and who had braved the frontiers and who had established homes and lands in England. So you're still talking about Frenchmen in England at that point. And this is happening around 475 to 525 AD, just in that about 50-year period. So anyway, all this happened, and Guillaume returned to France. He renamed Joyeux Garde Bellegarde and settled down. And, we're talking about a span of, well, almost as much time elapsed between then and William the Conqueror. About 500 years between Guillaume, William, and William the Conqueror. See, the family name was carried forward by the first son in each succeeding generation, and all of the knowledge and the records and everything were carried along for that span of time. So along comes William the Conqueror, and he's talking to King Edward of England, and he says, hey, look, I actually own all that land there. It's mine by right. And so they cut a deal. And Edward admitted it. He looked at the records, and he was a good Christian man, and he admitted the truth, and he agreed that William of Normandy would be his successor as King of England. But then after he died, his Privy Council, at that point is what would become the Privy Council, but his close advisors welched on it. And then you have the Norman Conquest, because William of Normandy felt that he had been cheated and that the deal had been broached. And he got a hair up his butt and decided to go across the channel and let him have it. So then we have the Norman Conquest. When he arrived in England, he began a gigantic inventory of everything that he conquered. I mean, he went through that country and he kept track of the last goat. He knew exactly where everybody was and what was there, what wasn't there, what his men added to it in terms of investment, what he added to it in terms of investment, all of it. And then surprisingly, in 1087, when he died and his will was read, he did something very surprising, or at least surprising to the world. He left all of the land that had been cataloged in England to his loyal barons, the men who had helped him conquer England. And he also granted them sovereignty in their own right on their own little fiefdom that he bequeathed to them. So instead of there being just one king, now there were a dozen or more. There were all these little fiefdoms that were all kind of patchwork together like a crazy quilt. And out of that, you had all these independent kings. And he did not give any land in England to any of his sons. His intention was that there would never be another king of England, so that there would never be that kind of consolidated power to oppose France again. And he did a pretty darn good job of it. So he disinherited his own sons from England, not from France. And the situation with his barons was kind of odd too, because they were kings in their own right in England, but they were still feudal barons and were subject to him or his sons in France, you see. And it was all calculated that France would have a much easier time because it wouldn't have England constantly at, the throat of France over every little thing. So this was his scheme. This was how he was going to, once and for all time, beat the English and be done with it. Okay. He saw them as a problem, as a complete source of trouble in the world, and that they should be cut up, diced and minced, so that they couldn't consolidate power and continue on with their warmongering. Fast forward 3 generations to his grandson, King John. He is called John Lacklands precisely because he didn't have any land in England, right? He had been disinherited. His father had been disinherited. His grandfather had been disinherited. They were all disinherited from England. So John Lacklands is drifting around, and he was a very peculiar character who had very bad luck. He had a bad gambling habit. He was always out of pocket. He spent his inheritance from his mother, and while crossing a swampy bit of land in Britain, he somehow just lost the crown jewels. So he was skint, right? And at this point, he's having an argument with the Pope. And the argument was about other things, but anyway, he wound up having this little kerfluffle with the Pope, and the Pope excommunicated him, and he had to go back and and beg mercy for his sins with the Pope. And when all this happened, there was a quid pro quo established that would give him a doorway back into England by managing the Commonwealth lands of the church in England. So he still didn't actually own any land in England, but he was managing and overseeing and ruling over the Commonwealth lands that the church held. Now, what do we mean by a commonwealth? This was a tradition that started in the Dark Ages, when a king or a local lord would give land to the churches. Usually it was swamp or a dry escarpment, or it wasn't real prime land, but he would give the church land, and then the church would use its labor force to improve the land and turn it into something. It might become a cemetery, it might become an orchard or a apiary or common pasturage or a woodlot. But whatever it was that the land seemed best suited for, the church would invest in it, right, and begin getting produce back from it one way or another, some sort of benefit for the community. So that was called Commonwealth land because it was the church land, and the members of the church and even people who weren't members of the church were benefited by it. The church used the land to produce food for itself and for the people that were dependent on the church, for their hospitals, and all their basic monasteries and the things that they did. So that Commonwealth land was very important to the church's survival and good fortune and ability to feed itself. And so it was not a small thing in the church's mind to have that protected. And so they figured they would protect the church land by getting grandson King John to watch over it, because even though he wasn't a king in England, he was still a king in France, and he could still crack the whip over the barons to a certain extent, simply by reference to France and their feudal oath to him in France. He could somewhat influence them to respect the Commonwealth land of the church and to protect the Commonwealth land of the church. And, he could influence things in England, even if he couldn't exactly rule over them. Anyway, so this was a smooth move on the part of the Pope, and it worked for John too, because it gave him a hand back into England. And this is about the time period where you see the Magna Carta come together. There were actually two treaties, and one is called something like the Charter of the Forest. I don't have the exact title to that, but one is a treaty on the soil and one is a treaty on the land. And the Magna Carta is the land treaty, and of course it's by far the more famous of these agreements. But what these were agreements among the barons who had become kings in their own right, and certain representatives of the local communities that wanted a means to express how they wanted to live and what sorts of rights and conventions, what kind of customs were they going to adopt with each other with respect to all these numerous different things that are covered in the Magna Carta. And so it became one of the great documents in human history outlining such concepts as rights to your person, your body, your land, your personal effects, how you dealt with neighbors, things of this nature. And by then, of course, England was very Christianized by the early 1200s. It had been started being Christianized in the Dark Ages. And England was solidly Christian by the 1200s. Ireland, not so much. Scotland, not so much. But Christianity had been broadly accepted in England by that time. And so when you are looking at this document, you're wondering, well, if they forced King John to sign it, wasn't that a coercive contract? And the answer is that no, it wasn't really, because you have to remember that they were kings in their own right, standing on their own soil, and he was just an overseer. So within the parameters of the roles and the authorities involved, he did not have the right in England to do anything but what they told him to do, actually. So it was not that kind of a duress. It was a circumstance of the authority that he had or failed to have. And so John signed on to it as the overseer of the Pope. And you have the Magna Carta. Well, all this is very interesting. It's even fascinating, and you can understand why the British have tried to hide the Norman French connection, and why they have with one hand they've held on to the story of Camelot, and on the other hand they've hidden the fact that it's a French story, not an English story, right? And they've hidden the basis of William of Normandy's claim, But coming out of all of this, you have a whole new system of government, and you have an entire new ruling class, which is French. It's all Norman French. It's not the native English people at all. It was not Anglo-Saxon at all at that point. So they came in and they were a totally foreign ruling elite. And that's pretty much how it stayed to this day. If you want to look around England, you will see all sorts of French names, and the Plantagenets were French, obviously. Names like Talbot, the Lord High Steward of England, is a guy named Ivan Talbot, another French name. And so if you look anywhere in England, you're going to see all these French names: Grenville, de Maupassant. It's just incredible how many French names are there. And it's because they came over in the Norman Conquest.
This was such a big moment when I was listening to you explain that. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, because, like last week, remember I told you a lot of folks just feel like, I don't know if I want to do this. Is this even legal? Is this even legal? Because they only know if something's legal. Is this legal? And then we need to just talk to them about lawful. This makes it so much easier, Anna. And then, like, why? What are you talking about, the crown and the Pope? How did this even happen? OMG. When I heard this, I was like, oh, no wonder. And also, like, okay, William the Conqueror, you think you're doing this great thing, and at the same time, your son's going to go crazy. And back then, they were, what, Gregory? Go ahead. You got something
Well,
to
was
say.
it his son or was it his grandson?
Grandson.
Grandson.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just trying to get the years, and that
Oh,
makes
yes.
sense. He was a couple generations behind, or
Right. And maybe he didn't even know him like that. I mean, he couldn't have possibly.
No, he
seems like
didn't know
okay.
King John didn't know William the Conqueror.
Right.
But
He wouldn't have known his
world.
heart. Like, he wouldn't have known his heart. He wouldn't have really known the strategy. He wouldn't have comprehended, what was the big deal. Obviously, their fathers didn't do a very good job passing that information along or impressing that upon them. you know.
Well, more so then than now, because you have to remember everything was passed on word of mouth, and a lot of people couldn't read or write.
Right.
So you'd be surprised. We tend to think that these people were so backward, but in many respects, they were smarter than we are about politics and land ownership and all sorts
Everything.
of topics.
Yeah, they would have died. I mean, like, we're so comfortable, it's pathetic. Like, honestly, when you look at the way things are, most people don't know how to take care of themselves. They wouldn't really know. It's not like you can drop people today out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, that's why they make shows, Anna. There's a television show called Survivor. Did you know?
Yeah, well, and even that is so phony. But
yes. Yes. But like they can make a game out of these things and act like it's a challenge. It's not. That was just life.
What I find really interesting about that story, I find it fascinating. So thank you for sharing. But I've been to Salisbury Cathedral, and that's where one of the copies of the Magna Carta is. And I would love to go back now after hearing that story, because there's so much neat history right there in that cathedral. And I'd like to make these ties now. I had no idea about the French, not necessarily influence, the French control, maybe is the better way to describe it. I had no idea.
Yeah. I mean, you make history fun, Anna. You make history fun, because it was the most boringest subject. I thought I was going to die every time in all of my history classes. And now I'm just like, oh, that was so cool. Or, and one of the big deals that I'm realizing in all the studying that I'm doing is, because I don't know about everybody else, Anna, but for me, it's about the timeline.
Yeah.
Everyone has something, but for me, I don't need to know every single fact, every single whatever. I don't have to go down the deep dives, but I just needed to be able, for me, as long as I'm putting the timeline together, it finally makes some kind of sense. Nothing ever made any sense. But when you start putting it on a timeline, it cleans so much up. And then it's very easy to see, oh, yes, of course. Like, it's very logical how we arrived in this moment. And then it's a lot easier to operate in your knowing instead of wondering, because everybody right now with the boots on the ground, Anna, are like, oh, you're going to be a target. And meanwhile, the more that I'm learning about the timeline, the more that I'm getting all the little bits and bots to fill in the gaps on the timeline, all it's doing for me is wanting to declare louder, be louder, be bigger. Like I have no problem with everyone knowing who I am and who I'm from and what it's about and what we're doing. There's no fear whatsoever. But yeah, at the beginning, when you don't know anything and you can't really understand how we arrived in this red hot minute, then it's just like, what are you talking about? So I wanted to bring this forward. And
sure. And I think Americans suffer terribly because they don't study world history.
Right.
And at the very least, they should study European history.
Yeah.
I mean,
how do you know what's true, Anna? This is the problem. It's like, how do you know? And then there's like 50 million books, none of which go together. The timeline is what I'm talking about. That really makes a big difference. It's when you start putting that timeline together and you see the sequential order in which things happen, then it makes sense. Like, oh, that person might have been a little bit crazy, but also we can see how they arrived there. It's a little bit easier to see how they got there. Just incredible. I mean, because I kept wondering, like, where is this? How did William the Conqueror not handle all? There weren't supposed to be a royal family, so how is there a royal family? This doesn't make any sense. Yeah. And so,
so now you see how they wedged their way back in the door, and then they had become kind of poor. They didn't manage their money and their lands wisely, and then you find Henry II marrying Eleanor of Aquitaine, a French queen who had vast holdings in the breadbasket of France. And so that's where their fortunes changed much for the better. And they had the money to provision armies and to undertake actions both in France and in England. And once again, you had this leitmotif of the French influence on England. But anyway, fast forward another 400 years to King Henry VIII. And we all know his story of his 6 wives, most of whom ended up beheaded and divorced. And he was a very rascally character in all respects. He was a man of great passions. He was a glutton. He was renowned for his sexual exploits. He was renowned for having syphilis. He was, he was just a real rounder of a guy, right? And he, not a very nice man in any respect, but he wanted to get divorced a second time. He wanted to be divorced the first time because his wife had failed to produce an heir. And of course, as a king, he needed to produce an heir. So the Pope allowed him to divorce his first wife. But then he found that his second wife wasn't all that satisfactory either. So he wanted to divorce her. And the Pope drew a line and said, well, we understood once, but twice? Come on. You're supposed to death do you part. And so the Pope said no to the second divorce. And there was this big flare up and split, and King Henry, this was going on at, the same time that the Protestant Reformation was going on. So even though Henry was no more a Protestant than he was a Catholic, decided to split off and promote a Protestant church, the Church of England, that he would be the head of. Okay, so he made himself the head of this new Protestant church known as the Church of England, also known as Anglican Church. And he and the Pope had a standoff for a few years, and then all of a sudden Henry goes over to Italy for a meeting. And I forget again, a convocation, I think, or there's a special word for it. But anyway, he went over to this special meeting and met up with the Pope, and they sat down cheek and jowl to settle their differences. And what came out of it is the 60-40 split. And basically, this is where the birth certificate fraud gets going, which has had a tremendous impact on our world even today. This was a baptismal certificate fraud instead of a birth certificate fraud. And basically what it was is they were claiming an interest, a material interest in the souls of everybody who was baptized. And up until that point, of course, with the Catholic Church being the only church that was baptizing people in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, they were the ones that were getting all the revenue from claiming a material interest in all these souls and then trading these souls on a sort of ecclesiastical black market. And they basically claimed all of your energy, all your intellectual, what they now call the PKI, your labor, your inventiveness, your performances, your patents, your copyrights, your various different acts, your ability to perform, to think, to invent. All those things are in the jurisdiction of the air. They're all considered to be attributes of the spirit or the soul. And so they were, quote unquote, securitizing, placing a value on these products of the soul, right? And they were claiming them through the baptismal certificate. And then they were trading these chits around as commercial devices. And this is back at the same time that the church was selling indulgences. Remember, Martin Luther gets there and he puts the 95 Theses on the cathedral door. Well, he was complaining about a practice of licensing sin. And yes, if you're not familiar with this, an indulgence is basically a license to sin. And it was extended to people who could pay enough money to buy one of these licenses. So, if
A license to kill, like the movie.
Yeah, a license to kill, a license to commit adultery, a license to steal, a license to, whatever. And so these indulgences were actual pieces of paper that were signed off on by the Pope that allowed, very rich men to do very obscene things and get away with it and not have to worry about eternal damnation because, the Pope had already pre-forgiven them. And they had this indulgence in their hand and they could, do whatever they wanted. I
don't think that's how the law works, Anna.
I made a lot of money on this, tongue in cheek. I did. They were just opening up the Apple Valley Renaissance Fair when I was in college in the Midwest there in the Minnesota. And so I and a friend named John Pope got together and we printed up all these, little scroll-like things that were indulgences, sin for a year. That was signed by John Pope, and we were selling these at the Renaissance Fair. Hand over fist, by the way. But anyway, we weren't charging the kind of price that the actual Pope, commanded during the Middle Ages. But anyway, this was a time when the church was becoming very commercial and very greedy and very proactive in terms of selling products that the church could, come up with. And indulgences was one of them. Wow. But another one was the baptismal certificate. And you hear that word again, certificate.
The coat checks. I just hear coat check.
Coat check, but the certificate. Okay, so when you got baptized, you were issued a birth certificate, and it was written down in the records of the church where you were baptized. And every year, just like a tax accounting, the number of people that were baptized were accounted for as properties of the church who claimed to own your soul, you see.
Because you were selling your soul. Yeah.
Essentially. Well, you were donating your soul.
Giving it away.
Yeah, donating.
Yeah, giving it away.
You were donating your soul to the church, and they were claiming full right and ownership of it. And they were then using that as collateral to finance businesses and things of this nature. Mm-hmm. Okay, so here comes Henry VIII, and he's split off and he's doing the Anglican Church. Well, to the Pope's mind, what's happened is that Henry is cutting into his business. Henry is stealing the cream off his baptismal certificate crop. And so the Pope and Henry sat down and they come to a quid pro quo. The Pope will get the baptismal value. He will receive all the souls of the Roman Catholics in the British realm. And he'll get full value for all the Catholic souls, right? And he'll get 60% on the Anglican souls. So whether you were baptized as a Roman Catholic or you were baptized as an Anglican, the Pope still had a majority property interest in your soul, you see. And Henry got 40% to grease his palm. So it's been 60-40 ever since. And they have been pulling the same crap with birth certificates as they have pulled with baptismal certificates. They're collateralizing and quote unquote securitizing and placing a value on your labor, your creativity, your skills and talents. And they're basically taxing all those things just as well as they're taxing your physical body
And your soul.
and your your land, whatever. They're placing a taxation on this based on these certificates, and they're getting away with it by pretending that you knowingly, voluntarily donated all this to them. Yeah. And they give you the certificate so that you can opt out if you know how and where.
So question on the timeline. So Henry VIII would have been 1500, roughly. So how does unum sanctum play into that timeline you were just laying out? Because I think that was 1302.
1302 for the Unum Sanctum Trust. That's when they began putting together their schematic of the world and establishing all the jurisdictions for air, land, and sea.
Yeah.
Or land, air, and water, which is the acronym for law. Okay, yep. This is where law comes into being, is when they were doing all of this. And basically, they were trying to develop a organizational plan for the jurisdictions of law according to the natural world. They were looking at the natural world and discerning how the air surrounds the globe and drifts all over the place and doesn't belong to any one country, and how the water is also international but much more contained, with some areas being landlocked and others having vast seashores, and quite a bit of difference. And then, of course, land being all unique.
Right.
So, and they were studying how these different realms of creation came together. You've got the coastal area that became maritime law. You've got the high seas where you have admiralty law, and you have the law of the land and the law of the air, which is in terms of practical things, the law of the air is the realm of commerce, where you have incorporated entities which are all completely dead. Okay, they're imaginary legal fictions, but you can see that the jurisdiction of the air is the jurisdiction of ideas and energy.
Yeah, so that's where the baptismal certificate. So the Unum Sanctum established the three jurisdictions, and then the baptismal certificates came from this concept.
Right. It was a way of latching on to all those attributes of the individual.
So that's when we say we have an idea. It came out of thin air.
Exactly. Right. And
the airy fairy world. Yeah.
Yeah.
And even your labor. Where does energy come from?
Right.
So air jurisdiction has a way of imposing upon all those attributes that are unseen.
That's where all the thoughts turn into things with the publishing, copywriting, all the patents and whatever. Wow.
Right.
That makes that really was a good story to tie a lot of things together to understand how we got to where we are now, or begin to comprehend how we got to where we are now.
Yeah, I wanted every day, every week for us to do something like this, Anna, because I feel like there are these rudimentary building blocks are what's missing for a lot of folks. And, I was talking with well, I'm talking to a lot of people from all over the place, and they feel offended if I'm like, I don't know you, so I'm just talking about things, based on the fact that you don't maybe know anything, and they're like, well, you're speaking to me like I'm a plebe or something, well, I don't know what you know and what you don't know. And did you realize that most people in the world today have no idea what's going on? So, like, when you're talking to me, you guys out there in the world, and you're just messaging me, I don't know you. So I don't know what you know and what you don't know. So we have to start at the very beginning, right? But I was hoping that we could iron some of these things out every week and clean it all up, because now I finally feel, Anna, like I can tell the story myself, because I know I didn't understand the beginning. I didn't understand that main baseline beginning, and I'm not sure very many people out there did. I
Well,
definitely know the people who are following me that are coming from the farm world, they definitely did not know that.
Right.
you know.
well, we are distant in time and space.
Mm,
And certainly with the Norman French, we are distant in language.
Mhm.
mm.
One of the biggest hurdles and hassles that we've had has been antique French.
Mm.
Now, I don't know if you're aware of just how profoundly different the language sounds over time.
I
But
can guess, because I just know Sanskrit and Hindi, or if you look at any of the base languages, you know, they're not at all
what's coming
what
out of your mouth today is not what was coming out a few hundred years ago, even
right.
200 years ago. When you go back and you start looking at all of the records that are associated with the War of Independence, and you're dealing with diplomatic French that's 250 years old, it's mind-boggling how difficult it is to read this, number one, because of the way it's written, and number two, to recognize the words which have morphed over time.
Mm.
It's a real scholarly endeavor to read those records. And
Well,
that's one of the reasons that it's so easy for people to obfuscate the history. Is that,
yeah. I
who's
mean,
going
just between English, American English, and the Queen's English. Good grief. I mean, look, Greg and I were talking, like we're exchanging information all the time just in the farming world. And like if you look at Alan Savory, he's South African, so he speaks the Queen's English, right? Well, when he teaches on America, then a lot of folks here can't comprehend what he's saying, and they're even offended by things that he says because they don't comprehend the language. And that's a big deal. And I realized that I've all my life spoken British English because we're Indian. And, even though I grew up, in the South, and to me, I'm a Carolina girl, but I only ever heard at home British English, and with our family and within our circle and all, because all the Indians only speak British English. So I didn't realize that that's all I was actually speaking, though it doesn't sound like it's British English with my Southern
right?
twang.
Well, there's this great book. It's called Two Nations Separated by a Common Language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. All right. So let's try to hit some of these questions too. So Elvia says, Elvia, I'm sorry, I might be saying that wrong. Why is the Judiciary Act of 1789 source of our authority? Dr. Eduardo Rivera says the act was never implemented. Why not? Civil War was decades later.
Okay. What happened is you've got three different federal level subcontractors. You've got an American subcontractor, you've got a British territorial subcontractor, and you've got a municipal subcontractor. Okay? And they all function under slightly different kinds or realms of law. Okay? So the way that the treaties, one way to think about this is the treaties that ended the War of Independence, what we call the Revolutionary War, were of different kinds. You had the Treaty of Versailles, which was about land issues. You had the Treaty of Paris that was about sea issues. And then you had the treaties of Westminster and Ghent and all these other treaties that treated a variety of other jurisdictions and issues in the air jurisdiction. There were, at the end of it, like 14 different treaties that were required to end the peace process of the Revolutionary War. So you've got 3 different contractors, and the constitutions are the implementation of the treaties. See, the treaties are working out all these agreements, but there's no way to, nothing in the treaties that says how they're going to be implemented. The implementation is the next step, which results in the Constitution. So there's a quid pro quo in the treaty that the king is going to be the trustee of the American shipping on the high seas and navigable inland waterways. That's in a treaty. That's in a treaty of Paris, because Paris treaties are about sea jurisdiction. So you've got this whole treaty series of Paris that's about sea issues, and you've got this other whole treaty series, Versailles, that's about land issues. And then when you come to implementing it, you've got 3 different constitutions, one for land, one for sea, and one for air, right? And they're all in international or global jurisdiction. The federal government doesn't have a thing to say about national jurisdiction. 0. And it was set up that way. The soil jurisdiction is its own thing. It's independent of that entire system. It's outside of the international and global system. So, okay, so if you think about it as the treaties set up the agreement, the constitutions implement the agreement, and you've got one subcontractor that is functioning on the land, and one subcontractor that's functioning on the sea, and one subcontractor that's functioning in the air, right? Well, now you're set up to begin to understand how the Judiciary Act worked. So you have this initial, what is called the initial federal constitution, the overall big kahuna constitution, which is the implementation of the Treaty of Versailles. Okay? This goes to the American subcontractor, and it deals with what? Land law. Because everything about it is about land. It's the Treaty of Versailles is about land. The grants that were made by the Spanish king, it's about land. The grants made by the French king, all about land. Grants made by the British king, all about land. All of this was concentrated on the American federal subcontractor, and the Constitution that was issued in 1787, known as the Constitution for the United, with a small u on United, States of America. Okay? That is the first federal constitution. And it's all about land. It's all about material assets. It's all about physical assets. Now the next treaty series is the Treaty of Paris, which is on the sea. And you have a British territorial subcontractor that is executing upon this agreement that the British king will be our trustee on the high seas and navigable inland waterways. And that means that they are dealing with what? Sea law, sea treaties. So out of the sea treaties comes the sea law, and comes the second constitution, which is called the Constitution of the United States of America, which was issued in 1789. All right, so what they did with the Judiciary Act of 1789 was to develop the sea jurisdiction and the sea jurisdiction courts. Sea jurisdiction courts are courts of what they call strictly limited jurisdiction. They're talking about things going on in maritime commerce and things going on in admiralty on the high seas and navigable inland waterways, okay? So they had to create their own specialty courts, and that's what the Judiciary Act of 1789 does. It splits off all these different courts, and it develops the kinds of courts that we have here today, the admiralty courts and maritime courts and administrative courts. All that stuff was developed by the British for their use, beginning with the Judiciary Act of 1789. So this is where we wound up with admiralty and maritime law and admiralty and maritime courts. And this, they've continued to cause trouble in this country ever since. But this is where the departure between the first subcontractor that had all three different forms of law under its belt, and the British that just had the sea jurisdiction to take care of. Mm-hmm. And so when you see the Judiciary Act of 1789, this is where the big bifurcation comes into land courts and sea courts. Article 3 courts versus Article 5 courts. And all these different kinds of courts had to be established under one of the constitutions at a federal level. So this is where the federal maritime commerce and admiralty courts took shape, was the Judiciary Act of 1789. And it's not the source of our authority. It's their courts. This is where their courts got implemented and defined
by our British subcontractors. That's where their authority is coming from.
Right. Yeah. This is what they developed to develop their courts. In this British territorial subcontractor had to develop its own court system in order to administer maritime commerce and admiralty law.
They're saying that Eduardo says the act was never implemented.
Well, there are a lot of confusions about this. He says it was never implemented because it doesn't have an enabling clause, and you have to have an enabling clause for an act, and to be implemented. But that he's not making the distinction between a public act and a private act. The Judiciary Act of 1789 is a private act within the context of the British territorial organization. It isn't a public act where they're going to mandate that you use their services or something like that. So it's a difference. If you're going to do something that affects the public, it has to be, for example, recorded in the federal record. It has to be in the congressional record. But the Judiciary Act is something that precedes all of this and is endemic to the actual structure, the structure building, the administrational organization of the British territorial subcontractor and what its functions are going to be. One of its functions is going to be to provide the maritime and admiralty court system. So, that's something that isn't a public matter. That's internal to them. Mm-hmm. So, it was implemented. It just wasn't implemented in the way that he thinks of it being implemented.
Gotcha. All right. This dude wants to know, if we are status corrected, do we have access to the common law courts in Ohio or any other state that has 4 pillars up?
Well, you have to understand that our courts are different than sea courts. Land courts are subject to the substantial nature of the land. Think about land being very solid and set, and sea being very mobile and fluid. Okay, so our courts don't extend.
Float around?
Yeah, we don't slide around, you know.
We're not floating around.
Our county courts only have jurisdiction within the physical borders of our counties. Our state courts only have jurisdiction within the boundaries of the state. And our national laws only have teeth within the boundaries of our nation, because our courts and our laws are substantive. There's a word for you. Think of the word substantial. It's something that has height and depth and weight and physicality and meaning. Well, so land law is like that, but it's also, it's very powerful. Land law is very, very powerful, but it's restricted in its domain. It can't just, Ohio can't come over to Minnesota and start making changes that are going to affect Minnesotans. In our system of the land law doesn't allow that.
So they would have to move whatever their case is into this other jurisdiction, and that isn't a done thing. We don't know, because we haven't had a land court in a long time.
Right.
So
right.
What? So if we're Americans, we're declared.
If you're an Ohioan, you'd have access to the Ohio courts.
But if you're a North Carolinian, basically, there is no moving jurisdictions. Because, we on television, Anna, on television, I guess it's because it's water. They can just like float around all over and go to any jurisdiction. But so in reality, on land jurisdiction, it won't work the same way?
No, it won't. The findings of one court will not determine the findings of another court in our system. But when they have something, a major decision by, say, a circuit court or an appeals court anywhere in their system, it affects them directly all over the country. So they are
the water people. You're saying the water people.
Yeah, the water courts, the sea courts. They will. They have a process which they call status, which they use as their guide. In that, once an issue has been thoroughly discussed and decided by one of their courts, it establishes this condition of having been decided, and then nobody else can look at it again. It's just decided, boom. In this particular case, on such and such a date, it was considered by a jury and blah, 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 blah. And here's how we interpret the law everywhere, whether it's in Georgia or Maine or California or New York, it's all the same. And it affects every state. And that's the way the sea laws work. We're lucky in a way that our land and soil jurisdiction courts that correspond to state and county courts are fixed and are powerful and are positive and are substantive. Okay, so this gives us some advantages and disadvantages. There's a very famous case. It's Jerome Daly versus the First National Bank of Montgomery. And this took place in Minnesota in 1968. A guy who was a lawyer in his own right was suing this bank because they hadn't actually loaned him anything on a mortgage.
Right.
He realized that they just loaned him his own credit and, took an unjust security interest in his property because it was an unearned, inequitable security interest in his property. Okay, so he sues him for it, and by golly, the jury said, yeah, he's right. They didn't give him anything of value. What in the hell do they deserve a security interest in his property for? And so the jury upheld him 100% and established this wonderful, wonderful decision known as the Credit River decision. The problem is, if you don't live in his county, it doesn't go beyond the county borders. It has to be refought and redecided in every single county in America to stop the mortgage fraud.
Okay, Baby Jane, or I don't know if I'm reading that correctly, are the Moors supposed to help restore the government? I have been hearing this, and that is why they are joining the assemblies and causing division.
Well, here's the deal. Way back at the very beginning of the country, even though we won the War of Independence, we were having trouble being recognized by other countries as the government. And this was sometimes because those countries had a very different form of government, or because they were loyal to King George and friends with him, and they didn't want to make nice with us. You know, there were all sorts of politics involved. But the Kingdom of Morocco stood up and said, we'll recognize the Americans. And the King of Morocco got a special deal. For his people, they would always have a special standing in America to be able to come here and visit and be treated as Americans, because they were the first country to internationally recognize us. So there's an actual treaty to that effect, that the Moors have this special standing as a gesture of friendship to the Kingdom of Morocco for recognizing our new government.
What do they mean about causing the division?
Well, I think this may be, it sounds to me like they are talking about specific groups of Muslim people coming into assemblies and then, like most of us, staying with their little clique of friends instead of going out and meeting and greeting everybody else. So you could have a Muslim group and a Christian group, and they could be at odds with each other.
Gotcha. All right. Chris Edward wants to know, where do we find access and cash in the usufructuary hold harmless bonds? Seems to me that would stop them from attacking us.
Well, they have to post hold harmless bonds when they do what they did in creating all of these franchises. Now, they don't necessarily actually underwrite those bonds anymore. They're doing something called self-insurance, which is kind of a two-edged sword. If they write their own insurance and stand behind their own insurance policy, then there is no other third party standing in the way and protecting them. And so when they self-insure, those hold harmless bonds become an unstated liability. They have no idea or no way of knowing how much or how little they're going to have to pay out as hold harmless bonds in any given year, right? So that's a one by one in terms of their hold harmless bonds. Different states have different practices. Alaska is a self-pay state. So You just sue them, and whatever the damages are, that's what they are. Other states have got actual bond funds, and you wind up with a whole different scenario where you're actually dealing with insurance companies and you're making a claim against their insurance. So essentially, a hold harmless bond results in an insured claim for you as the usufruct that you can go in and say, hey, I didn't agree to have a municipal franchise created in my name. You owe me the usufructuary rights and duties.
All right. Some of us are forced to incorporate to get jobs as independent contractors and get liability insurance through our work I guess, and does not involve the federal government. As admins, work is admins, as admin. Do you get this question, Anna?
I've been in that position, so I understand what they're asking.
Okay, ask it properly.
Well, so what they're saying is to be a 1099 contractor, they're getting a contract that flows down to them. They got to get liability insurance that meets the requirements of the prime contractor. And to do that, you have to get incorporated to go to the insurance company to get the insurance that's required by the contract. I hope I'm not misstating what they're trying to ask, but that's my experience.
Yeah. Pardon me. Life as an independent contractor is anything but easy.
Yeah.
I can
because you can't control all the other parts of it. Although I do know folks that are doing this, and they are doing it with honor, and they're working with people honorably and telling them, I'm not going to do that way. And they, they're just gonna they are limited to who they can work with, but they are able to work.
I think that works good when you're a small business,
right?
If
you're trying to
to an independent contractor, but if you have a incorporated corporation, that's where the challenges come in.
Right.
Because their insurance.
I know a lot of folks, Elvia or Elvia, that I know a lot of folks that are walking away from those larger operations and creating something that they can manage themselves, so they don't have to participate in this. Because when you reduce the size of what it is that you're doing, I mean, if you're in a position to do that, I don't know, like a lot of people I know, especially that are declaring, they are deliberately and intentionally walking away. So there's that.
Well, there's also this. You can incorporate as a land jurisdiction corporation instead of a sea jurisdiction corporation, as you learned, Niti.
Yes.
And that's just a matter of asking for the right paperwork. Because when you walk in and you say, I want to incorporate something, I want to incorporate a business, what they automatically assume for their own self-interest is that you want to incorporate as a state-of-state corporation, right? So they'll hand you the paperwork for the state of Iowa or the state of Nevada or the state of Maryland, right?
Right.
And you not knowing any better, you just figure, well, this is the paperwork to form a corporation and get out my little red pen and away I go, right? But actually, as an American, your better choice is to require them to produce the state, not the state of state, but the state corporation paperwork, which they can do. And then you become incorporated under the state trust. Now, that's still not perfect, but it is it has to be viewed as a land jurisdiction trust. So even though it's in a trust and not in the actual state that we think of, it is something that belongs to the state. It's an asset and charter of the state. Okay, so the hard part is that the Brits still have it cashiered over here in a state trust. The good part is that it's still the state. It's still the land and soil.
Yeah.
You know, as we get booted up here and more people figure this out, and we all figure out how to liquidate the state trust by exempting ourselves from it and exempting our property from it, the more meaningful it will be.
Right. We are having this conversation pretty regularly on the weekends, Anna, and if you guys go to our to the link in the show notes, then you can sign up for the self-governing business thing that I'm working on, and we are having exactly these conversations to try to finesse this or comprehend it in a better way, so that because I don't know what your details are, and we can't really know that out of this one question here on this YouTube box. You were going to say, Gregory?
I wanted to pull a little bit of a thread on that, and it goes back to a video that Anna did in 2019 that you sent to me, Niti, and she talks about being, the small p people,
yes,
the big P people being corporate, but not corporated.
Yes.
So it makes me think, was it Belshare's Auto Shop or something was an example I think I remember hearing on that video, where you have, let's say a group of small p people creating something that's a big P people, but it's not incorporated. So what my question is, in today's world, you could create that, go get an EIN as a non-incorporated organization or whatever it's called. What does the term DBA do? What does doing business as really mean? And is there a way to DBA your unincorporated thing and convince this insurance company? I'm trying to think of a solution for this individual.
Right.
Yeah.
A DBA is an assumed name, so that we have the assumed name certificate.
Right.
So that's it. Yeah, that's what we use, as an assumed name certificate.
Okay.
Yeah.
And as silly as it sounds, it doesn't incorporate you in any way. It's just an assumed name.
It's an assumed name, but when you register an assumed name, it's on the sea, and when you record an assumed name, it's it's on the land. And so the crucial difference between a maritime commercial corporation and a commercial corporation, just a plain old commercial corporation, is where it's set up.
Yeah.
And so if you want to set up a maritime corporation that deals in maritime commerce, by all means, go ahead and set up a state-of-state application to incorporate. Because then you'll be under that law. You'll be standing under sea law, and you'll have access to maritime commerce and admiralty from that position. But if you want to operate a farm, for example, say that I want to, this is an old joke of ours, but say that I want to name my farm Honeydew Farm. And,
Yep.
So I write that out, and I do the assumed name, and I record it as part of the state trust. Well, then I own that name, and they have to give me the benefit of the state trust, and they have to include my land as under the protection of the state trust. And then I, as the owner, can dissolve the state trust at will as the donor. You see?
Yeah.
So it's kind of a backdoor dance you around again, Willie. But if you incorporate as a state corporation as opposed to a state of state corporation, you have that advantage and ability as the donor to liquidate the trust at will and claim your exemption from all the BS that goes on.
Right.
Because ultimately the state trust is built upon the land that I stand on. And you can exempt that from there.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is the little dance I did that really absolutely frustrated the ever loving out of them. So I go back in and I reclaim my reversionary trust interest. Okay, so this is the same basic maneuver as if you that's at a federal level, but you're operating at a state level. So it's the same basic maneuver as if you take your land. Okay, so you've got your land, you've got your entire roster of different descriptions of the land, right? You've got the plat book name and number and page, and you've got the subdivision and the borough planning lot and block, and you've got the mailing address description. You've got the borough or the city, 1544 Moose Haven Drive. You've got all of those listed, right? All these different descriptors and descriptions of your land. Now, why do all these other entities have to have a descriptor of your land? Because they're going to try to latch onto it somehow or another through these descriptions. So you want to list all these descriptions, and you want to have an overarching description of your land that is physical. It's based on substance like landmarks, meets and bounds, physical cadastral survey that shows where it is precisely, right? This is yours that you bought and paid for, and you want to name it whatever you want. Say that according to the government, your parcel is associated with the land description 8940 Park Rise Road. You take your land description, your survey that you've created or that you've had done as work for hire, and you name it Billy's Bluff. You name it whatever you want it to be, and you record that. And when you record your interest in that, you subsume all those other descriptions. This parcel to be known henceforth as Billy's Bluff Road. Whatever you want to say about it, whatever name you want to give it, okay, whatever description subsumes all of these different other descriptions, and is the proper physical description of the property that belongs to Josephine B. Klephopper. Okay, so now you've recorded that, and if you wanted to incorporate it as a farm, as a business, and you wanted to then incorporate a business interest related to that as a farm, then you would get the state corporation form, and it would be, Honeydew Farm Incorporated, right? But it would be under the state and under the state trust, not the state of state. And at that point, you're accepting the Queen's or the King's offer to be your trustee on the high seas and navigable inland waterways, because what is this thing you're creating? It's a corporation, right?
Right.
And the King and the Queen are now standing over this entire country because it's occupied, right? So they're the trustee, right, of the state trust.
Mm-hmm.
But because you are a donor to the state trust, you can also liquidate the state trust and claim your exemption from it. If you're a donor, you're in a completely different position than if you're a beneficiary. And unfortunately, most people get stuck in the position of being beneficiaries. So if you're a beneficiary of the state trust, even though it sounds better, right? Everybody wants to be a beneficiary. Then you are at the mercy of the trustees. And the trustees are the black robes who take it to be their job to make commissions off of condemning you and convicting you of anything they can possibly convict you of. And I explained how that works with the article on the courts for hire that we just released last week. So you don't want to be in a position where you are at the mercy of the trustees of the king, right? Because they're always going to protect the king's interest. Instead, you want to walk in as a donor
Mm-hmm.
and dissolve the trust and claim your exemption from it, whatever it is that they're harassing you about.
But can you only be a donor if you are the landowner?
Well,
Because the trust is based off of the land.
yeah, well, here's the problem. Unless you own it free and clear, then the bank has a lien on it and they continue to have a lien on it.
Yeah. But if you own the land free and clear,
if you own it free and clear,
do all the steps we talked about, rename it, then you're the donor. You're a true donor to that trust, to the state trust.
Right.
Okay.
Right. The moment
this is such a big deal. This clarification that's happening right now. And this is why we're wanting to bring these questions, Anna. I'm sorry to have interrupted right there, but this is so important.
Yeah, this is wonderful. And it's really wonderful for everybody, obviously, but for farmers in particular, particularly family farms that have had this ground passed down through the generations, it's so critical that they get true ownership of it. It's so critical.
Right. Well, and there's the other option. You don't have to incorporate at all. I mean, the only reason that you would incorporate in any of those venues was if you had a reason to,
Right.
And actually, I think an awful lot of farms and a lot of other businesses have incorporated that just did that because their lawyer told them that was the thing to do, and so they did it. But
exactly, yeah.
If you leave it unincorporated, then you stand outside that whole, revolving circle, and you're safe and on the land, and all you have to do is record your interest in it, which is, what I suggest people do, because I think incorporation is at best a dangerous scam. Yeah. And, if you don't know your way around it and don't know how it works and don't have a real clear vision of how the state trust is different than the state of state and all those different jurisdictional issues, why even bother? I mean, unless my view of corporations is that they were originally created, business corporations were originally created to keep businesses investing in very dangerous different kinds of business, like manufacturing gunpowder and nitroglycerin and manufacturing guns and poisons and things that could really have intense liability associated with them.
I thought it was like for the railroad, Anna. I thought like the reason that we did incorporations was to do big projects that were for a limited amount of time. For example, when they established the cross the country railroad, then they needed some way to organize and to operate together as they built this out across the country. And it was supposed to, it was only for the amount of time that the project was running. Once the railroad was built, that railroad company was supposed to dissolve, or the corporation.
Yeah, they do that at the federal level. They do that every time there's a war. You'll note that.
Oh, you mean like these pretend ones?
These
emergency pretend ones?
These mercenary conflicts that are always emergencies. If you watch
emergency, what is the emergency?
If you watch it, you can discern it. You can see how they work it.
Yeah.
For every war, there is a major umbrella corporation. Yeah. Like in World War II, it was U.S. Corp. In all capital letters. So that was a municipal umbrella. Okay, so they have this thing called U.S. Corp. And that was stamped on every damn thing you can think of, from spoons to canteens to blankets, you name it, it was stamped on it. After the war, what happens? Well, then you have what? War surplus. You've got all these factories geared up and churning out war supplies in vast quantities. You've got warehouses full of this crap, and what are you going to do with it? Well, you're going to go bankrupt because you no longer have a market to sell all this war tat, right?
Right.
So the U.S. Corp creates all of this as an umbrella and buys all of this stuff and signs all these contracts with these vendors. And when the war ends, they have to close up shop. And so they bankrupt the U.S. Corp, right? And they sell off all this war surplus on pennies on a dollar, right? The bankruptcy court disposes of it. And this is how you have all these war surplus warehouses and huge amounts of stuff left over after every war. But the only one that goes bankrupt is the umbrella corporation, not the actual suppliers.
So it seems like that is the reason behind incorporating, is so that you can go bankrupt, because a living entity, an unincorporated thing, or a living man, living woman, can't go bankrupt.
Exactly. And so the reason that such corporations exist is to go bankrupt if and when they need to, at the while protecting the shareholders' interest.
Right.
So here's the shareholder all during the war, soaking up all the money, rolling in all the profit from all these armaments and all these contracts to supply things like, spoons and canteens and guns, and all this stuff is being produced, and all these people are profiting from this, from the sales off of this. But they always intend that at the end of the war, the umbrella corporation that's fronting all this is going to go bankrupt.
Yep.
Yeah.
And same thing.
By design. By design.
Yeah, it's bankruptcy by design. And it was originally to get people to do things like invest in nitroglycerin factories where the thing could blow sky high, and and they would lose everything. But it's a way to limit the risk for the investor.
Well,
right?
To your point, a farmer standing on his land is not planning to go bankrupt. That's not the intent in any way, shape, or form. So why would they incorporate?
Right. You wouldn't.
You wouldn't.
Because incorporation then drags in all the regulation and all the taxation and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And
it's hard enough to be a farmer without all of that on top of you. That's for sure.
Or any business owner. I mean,
any business.
We're talking about the farmers, but I mean, it doesn't matter what you're doing.
It applies to all small businesses.
Right. Yeah. I think that everybody, you guys, come talk with us, because we're having really good conversations about this, and then we can bring more questions for Anna, to iron that stuff out. Beth, there's a link in our link tree in every single set of show notes, and there are buttons for you to push so you can help share your information. And Anna, we're almost going 2 hours, and I'm always trying to control it, but then we have so much fun. And then Greg keeps bringing up good points. And then, we're just having a really good time. And I really love and appreciate you for the time that you make for us. I really hope that we are answering the questions for all the men. There was a big request, a big push for people who are working to have answers because they want to be able to contribute to their assemblies. They want to be able to contribute to this great work that you're doing, Anna. And they just need to know how to navigate their way through their actual work. And men, we love you. We know that all the men out there have to go make the money for the homes, and a lot of folks are going to call me a racist and a bigot and whatever, but I don't care, because you know what? We know that we have to do the things. The women do the research. We do all the things to save the men and to mend the men and bring them and get them back to health. Right, Anna? Isn't that what you're doing? You're doing all the research and all the teaching and all of everything to get everybody stood back up. And now you got Jim home and you're feeding him and you're nursing him. And this is what women do. And the men are the protectors and the ones who go out there and get the things done.
And it makes them very frustrated when they can't do that too.
Exactly. This is what men want to do, and they want to be able to do it. And, we're not going to be like those other guys, the water guys, the diminishing corporatocracy people that are out there breaking men down. We're not for that. We're not here to break the men down. We need to get our men back. We need to get all the American men back and standing. We need to rebuild them, and they can't do it if we're not giving them the information that they need. So that's what I'm focusing on, Anna. That's what we need to do, because they're asking for it. They're ready. They know that there's something wrong. They don't have the energy to do anything else, but they're listening to this show while they're driving around. They're learning and they're figuring things out.
The decay and the attack starts on the family.
That's right.
And it starts by encouraging unaccountable activities.
Exactly.
Okay, over 40% of American children are being born in families with only one parent.
Yeah.
Gee, I wonder why, because doesn't Rome take all the bastard children, Anna, and turn them automatically into slaves? Isn't that what they call them?
Yeah, and on top of that, the welfare is paying all the costs.
Yep.
So, a lot of guys are skipping town and saying, well, they're fine. I don't have to worry about them. She'll get.
They don't, or they can't, Anna. That's not really, or they can't. A lot of these guys want to be a part of their family, but they can't do that because why? When they got married, they put the government, which is the de facto corporatocracy, in between them and their wife. And they didn't know that was what was happening. And then when they try to break away from that, then who gets the benefit? Not the mom and not the dad. It is the corporatocracy. And they're doing this to destroy the home, period.
Right.
And we're trying to get the men and women back together again. And
between the carrot of the welfare money and the stick of having no support in your home.
Right.
You know what happens. Even if a guy tries to stay with his family, DCF comes in and says, oh, you have a man living with you. Who is he? What's his relationship? Oh, he's the biological father. Oh, well, then we'll have to include his income. And, we're going to cut your income to nothing because, you're living with the biological father of these children. He should be supporting them.
Yeah.
See, and it just cuts what they've got in this world in half, or even more. And so a lot of young people are struggling with this and trying to, work the system to get more money out of the system. And they're losing sight of what it does to them in terms of their legal status, their rights,
their lawful status.
Well, even in their peace of mind and in the honor of their relationship. I mean,
their children themselves. Everyone is in a state of self-diminishment, and it is at least I know it's definitely my hope and my prayer for everyone that you can just know how important you are and know that you matter and know that you were just born worthy beyond belief. And I'm really sorry that these monsters have done this. And
Yeah.
you just have to reparent yourself because there isn't anybody coming to save us. There isn't anybody for us to call. Trump isn't going to fix this. Okay, friends, you're going to have to do this by yourself. We're going to have to do this on our own. And so we're calling all men, and we're also calling all the women to support the men, because that is the way that it works. We have to work together, and we can't be allowing them to divide us the way that they have. And this is a problem.
And I'm so blessed to have been married now for coming up on 31 years. So I've had that strong woman doing all those things you said, Niti. And when I feel sick, yeah, I agree with Jim. Men don't like to be down. They don't like it at all. We're uncomfortable. My wife might call me a baby even when I'm not feeling well, because we want to be out doing stuff. So
right.
Yeah.
You're hard to take care of because they don't want to be held down. I mean, and we couldn't do what we were doing if we weren't standing on y'all's shoulders.
Exactly.
I stand on the shoulders of my husband for 100%. Like, if I can't stand on his shoulders, there's no way for me to be able to do all the things that I do either.
It's almost like God intended it this way, didn't he?
I don't know.
Imagine that.
Imagine that. Imagine that.
I'll just share this for the sake of any young people who happen to be watching this in years to come, okay? And I know that we don't have a huge audience of young people, but I hope someday that we do. I was 32 years old before I fell in love. That's a rarity. I mean, most girls are boy crazy from the time they're 13, right? But I just didn't have time. I had all sorts of other things I was going to go see and do. And I was just be bopping around, meeting people and having fun. And I just didn't get bitten by that particular bug until I was 32 years old. And then I had to really stop and consider, because I've been a spinster, right? I've been a spinster for a long time. I had gone out and really tromped around and done stuff. So, do I want to give up my freedom and my not-headedness and my independence and go settle down with some furry-faced man? And I'm sitting there, I'm really going, I don't need a man. I've got my life. I've been able to, support myself and do everything. But I'll tell you what, after I finally decided, I'm going to go do it and made that commitment, it felt wonderful, because it just settled so many things, and it allowed me to build a life in a way that I couldn't any other way. And so I recommend marriage to young people, and I don't consider it just if you want to. I think you should. I think for your own sake, you need to make that commitment, make it official, stand by it, get your back up, and really commit to that relationship. Be serious, and you'll find that it enhances your life and enriches your life in ways that you can't even imagine if you waffle around and try to avoid the serious part of it.
Right.
Just go for it. Make it happen.
I highly recommend.
I was going to say, I second that, Anna. That's
yes.
Definitely.
Yes. Anyway, we love all of you guys, and we hope that you enjoyed the teaching today. We're going to keep bringing more of this, and we will see you next Tuesday.
Tuesday.
Bye, everybody.
See you guys later. Take